but if you're new to the Small Giants community, welcome. I'm really excited to have Devin and Leslie with us today because I'm just really curious about what's going on and what their perspective is on the economy and how that's going to affect all of us in our businesses. So we're going to get right to it, and really want you guys to be active. Use the chat, use the raised hand feature, ask your questions. We're just going to have a really good casual discussion. I want to introduce Devin Bachman. Devin is the VP of Research and Consulting for John Burns Research. She has been with the Small Giants community for a long time, very active, and their expertise primarily is around consulting and research in the real estate industry, which kind of tends to drive a lot of what happens in the economy. So excited to hear from Devin about that. And Leslie Holland, who's Regional Director of Portfolio Management for BNY Mellon Bank. So Leslie, thank you for being here as well. And Leslie has a more national and global perspective on economic trends, and happy to hear what you have to share as well, Leslie. So I'm going to start out really generally with you guys just to get a sense of what you're seeing, knowing what the topic is, knowing who our audience is as small business people going through crazy times in all respects, from not only the economy, but the world and instability, et cetera. So Devin, let me start with you. What's going on? What are you guys seeing overall?
Yeah, I'll just give you kind of a high level summary, and then I know we're going to jump into a lot more detailed conversation here. But unless you've been living under a rock, you would realize that real estate and housing has been kind of a major topic of conversation over the last few years. Obviously, a little bit of history lesson. We saw the massive spool up in demand during the COVID-related pandemic as people flew to kind of housing as a security blanket. And that was the first time we saw this become like okay, my house is my safety, right? Rates were low. The market was juiced for growth. That's what happened. Hello, inflationary environment that we're seeing today. Now the Fed has stepped in and said, okay, I see you, inflation, and I'm going to raise rates in order to curb this. And that is absolutely a juggernaut to housing, because the rates are critical to what happens in the housing mecca. But it's been interesting, Paul. It's not exactly what everybody thought. So as the Fed raises rates, this creates complications in the marketplace, both from the consumer finance perspective, which is mortgage, but also the industry perspective. We'll talk about that probably later. I'll stay on housing for now. But as rates have risen, the resale market has just shut down. It's gone into complete gridlock. 80% of homeowners today have a sub 5% mortgage. Sounds like a heck of a reason not to move, what we are calling the lock-in effect today. So that market has really just locked itself up. Now, interestingly, the new home market has soared. 30% of homes available for sale in the US today are new construction. That's the highest percentage we've seen in a very long time. 13% of US sales are new construction, off a 10% average. Why? They're using a creative financing tool called a mortgage rate buy down, where they prepay interest and they can get that consumer interest rate down. So instead of looking at a 7.5 or even an 8 today, that builder might be able to buy you down to 6 or 5.5. So it's this incentive to pick new construction that we haven't really seen in the past. Obviously, as rates rose, we created an affordability crisis. Would love to dive into that later, Paul. I have some great stats on just how tight affordability is today. So that's been a juicer for the rental industry. So apartments, build to rent, single family rental, that was a flight to affordability. Now there's a lot of supply coming and rents have risen there. So I think we're in for some more turbulence as it comes to that sector. And probably last but not least, a shrinkage in households as a result of this affordability crisis. So I'll leave it there, very high level, but open to any follow-up on those specific sectors. I don't know if anybody's invested in or related to any of those sectors, but those are kind of what we cover from a housing specialty. Back to you, Paul.
Great. Yeah. Obviously lots of change over the last couple of years. Leslie, what about you? What are you seeing overall?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Thanks, everybody, for the opportunity. It's nice to see you all virtually. Similar to what Devin orchestrated, the economy and the market has also experienced a pretty wild ride. I would share with all of you that from our perspective, we're in a very unprecedented period. A lot of change, as Devin mentioned, around just going from low interest rates to much higher interest rates. And we'll talk a little bit about that, how that's impacted the economy and the consumer. And then next year's an election year. And so all eyes are really on the US. I will share with the group that we believe that the US economy, consumer, just changes that took place after COVID puts us about 18 to 24 months ahead of our global peers. So, that is something that you'll hear from me today, is the theme is going to be very US focused. And perhaps for you all as small business owners, that's great news from a healthy standpoint, from an opportunity standpoint. All eyes are kind of on that domestic aspect. In addition, just because of things being so unprecedented, hopefully we'll give you all a few nuggets to take away today on where we're going from here. Because it's been such a wild ride for the last 3 years. There's some pretty good bright spots, and we definitely want to give you all some takeaways around some positives. And, really what we're looking for, whether you're an investor, small business owner, or again, just a consumer, where are some of the opportunities out there? So a lot of change, but looking for some bright spots, and happy to be a resource.
Yeah. When I think about, Leslie, our audience and, small business owners, next gen leaders, we've been talking over the last couple of months just in our regular conversations about how things are going. And people seem to generally be having a tough year. There's obvious exceptions to that. People are having a hard time selling, new business, growing their companies. It just seems to be really rough for people. And at the same time, you'll hear indications that the economy is actually pretty strong, that there's now a much less of a chance, or 50-50 or whatever, on a recession. Stock market's been resilient during the year. So how do you reconcile these things, that people seem to be suffering, and yet some of the economic indicators we see in the Wall Street Journal are actually pretty positive?
Yeah, I think great question. If I rewind us from a year ago, things were looking rather dire, and I think that probability of what we kind of call in the market a deep recession was very likely. So really, what has changed, and why has the stock market become so resilient and has stayed so resilient? One figure I'll share with the group is, historically, the stock market is about 6 months ahead of the economy. So the market knows, right, where we sit on all this data. That's kind of what Devin was referring to. The market is a forward-looking lens. It really doesn't look through the windshield, through the rearview mirror. It's almost like through the windshield. So keep that part in mind, that historically the market is ahead of where you start learning about some of this dismal economic data. So it tends to be a little more robust, if you will. And so with that, there is a direct correlation between the stock market performance and the unemployment rate. So if there's one thing you taught your kids to watch, is if the unemployment rate is high, the market typically is down. If the unemployment rate is low, historically the market does well. There's a inverse correlation, if you will. And so as of very recent data, and this stuff gets revised all the time, I'll have you write down the unemployment sits today at 3.8%. So you might say, well, what does that mean? Well, for every job that's open, we can actually find 2.5 people looking. So in other words, 2.5 people could find a job yesterday. That's just what the unemployment rate is showing us today. Now, here's the good news. 64% of new jobs in 2023 were generated by small businesses. So, and I define those as companies with less than 50 employees. So you all, or as we say in Texas, y'all, are the growth engine of this country. And so in addition, small businesses provide over 44% of the overall economic activity. So there have been a lot of metrics to make sure that small businesses can hire these folks that are actively looking. And then the two main drivers, in our opinion, of why the market has been so resilient is I talked about that unemployment rate, and that dovetails directly to the consumer, you and me. Devin knows this fun fact, but the consumer drives 75% of the US GDP. So what you and I do with our discretionary spending is why we've stayed propped up and why we haven't gone backwards and why we haven't gone into a deep recession. Specifically during COVID, we all bought a Peloton, we all bought a Tesla, and now we've kind of migrated into this experience economy, right? We all went on cruises again. We all jumped on planes again. We now believe, and small business owners should benefit from this, we're hopeful, that we're now kind of going to this lower cost economy. We are looking for things to arrive on our porch by drone within 3 hours, but we're being very choosy with how we spend our discretionary income. And then the second aspect, and we joked a little bit on the call as a group, the second main driver of why the stock market has been so resilient this year is artificial intelligence, AI. And if you all kind of scroll at the bottom of your table, there is actually an AI companion, even that Zoom has brought into your lives. So everyone is listening, and the robots and the computers are going to say how good this data is and all that fun stuff, and get this team really good information. But in general, for 2023, the AI has benefited really 7 main stocks or 7 big companies in the market. I'll rattle them off really quickly. They're very familiar to all of you, but we call them the Magnificent Seven. So Apple, Microsoft, Google, Amazon, NVIDIA, Tesla, which I already mentioned, and Meta, which is Facebook. And so those 7 names have completely ignored all of the economic data that we're reading, has completely ignored even the word recession. Because of AI, it has now added $4 trillion in market cap. Year to date alone, it's here to stay, and it's combined, those 7 names have combined 40% of the market performance. So whether your kids are using ChatGPT to write their papers as their reference, you can call that legal or illegal. We could talk about that at a different time. But, you know, AI and the consumer is why we just have not slid backwards. And perhaps, again, AI is here to stay, and we can talk a little bit more about that if the group has any interest.
Yeah, you know, you talk a lot about historical trends, and we've had previous conversations, Leslie, where you'll talk about just the instability that's going on globally. World events, obviously, we're in the middle of this Middle East conflict. As you said, we're going to be entering an election year. But are we in a period now where sometimes the historical norms don't even matter because we're making new history today? I mean, how much can we rely on that trend that you look from the last 20, 40 years of the market to really predict today what's going on? It just seems like we're in these really strange and new times.
I would completely agree with you. You know, if I were a small business owner, I would take a lot of that data and completely throw that out the window. You make a very good point. And again, kind of to my earlier unprecedented times, right? Because of interest rates being raised 11 times for the first time in our history, unprecedented. Because of what could have been a severe bank collapse this spring, and what are the fallout effects of that? Unprecedented. The consumer faced with higher inflation, and again, how we change our lifestyle and household, completely unprecedented. And so yes, as business owners, you're right, those 3 things, higher interest rates, bank issues, I don't want to open a can of worms, but, you know, and again, inflation that might be here for the first time, to your point, in 40 years. Yes, there are less lending to small businesses. The free money is basically gone. And, you know, with ongoing geopolitical issues, it is very unstable. And so, you know, when you kind of take a step back and you can unemotionally look at things, you know, good old-fashioned economics tells you we're probably going to be okay. And what I mean by that is there's obviously very serious situations bubbling geopolitically, which is kind of one of the reasons why we tend to like more of a domestic focus. We think the even American consumer is going to have more of this buy in the USA mentality. That was also directly correlated to the supply chain issues we felt during COVID and post-COVID kind of reopening. So, you know, I think we do have to rely on history as a guide, but I think some of the economic data that you and I just kind of went through, I would throw a lot of that out the window. We have pretty good numbers, and again, I want to be very sensitive to the geopolitical issues that are going on, but when we go back all the way to the 30s and we look at these major geopolitical events, I have to be honest with you, Paul, when you take the emotion out and you look at just numbers, 6 months and 12 months after, the market and the economy tends to be okay. So we are just kind of reinforcing that with our clients, that there will be, I think the one thing that's changed for the good is there is much more global synergy and global things that are being orchestrated for good. And so with that in mind, we do have that history as a guide. And like I said, 6 months, 12 months after, things will be okay.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I like the positive approach and outlook on it all. Devin, I want to come back to you, and you shared a lot of what's going on in housing. How do you see that as a lens of what's actually going on in the economy overall? Is it a precursor to what we're seeing? And for the small business people that are on the call, what should they take from what's going on in real estate today?
Yeah, and Paul, I'd love to step back and just make a few comments on what Leslie mentioned as well. I had some points to add there, and then I'll jump into kind of what the tea leaves are saying for 24, 25. And Leslie, I like your stance of like the good news, bad news, because that's very much how I'm thinking about it. Like we have a lot of risk indicators out there that are maybe flashing, and ones that we thought should have been flashing that maybe aren't. So geopolitical risk, I agree with you. Obviously, that's going to have downstream impacts on the US consumer. One thing I do want to bring back, which I'm very much of the mindset that, to Leslie's point, history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes, right? So there are going to be instances where it may look similar. And when we go back all the way to 73 and the OPEC-induced oil embargo, that created a lot of stress for the US consumer around gas shortages and high gas prices. I do think that's not out of the realm of possibilities. Good news on that, though, is that the US is producing more crude oil than they ever have been, about 50% more than back in 73. But there's also significantly more people in the world than there were in 1973. So I do think from the consumer perspective, it's that, you're going to hear me say this a lot today, that share of wallet conversation. Everything's more expensive, housing included. So how is that consumer going to spend their wallet share on various goods? I do think that while the Fed is working hard to cool inflation, and they've got it down to 3.7% today from 9%, they are sticking hard to the 2% target. And to me, that means higher rates for longer. So again, if we do a little bit of a history lesson here, and we go back to the 1990s in the Greenspan era, if you look, and there's a similar but different characteristic happening with, Leslie, to your point, AI, that we saw with e-commerce. And you see the Fed in the 1990s, and if I had a chart, it would look like this, so watch my hands. The rates rise, e-commerce booms, but the Fed holds rates at what is an elevated level in order to tamper inflation. I think we're probably going to see a lot of that in the coming year to 2 years. Higher than normal levels of interest rates. Maybe not an 8%, but I think, and the 10-year Treasury and the futures market is calling for rates 5 to 7, even 8% over the next few years. So I think, yes, we can aim for this soft landing, but what people aren't talking enough about, Paul, is the fact that the soft landing sometimes comes with challenges. And one of those challenges is higher than usual inflation and thus interest rates. Something we haven't talked about yet, but is the job market in general and its surprising resiliency. So the US economy added about 336,000 jobs in September, which is the highest month this year outside of January. I mean, that's a really solid jobs number. But what I want people to pay attention to is where the jobs are being added, because the BLS has a breakout of subsectors, and a lot of the jobs being added today are in the typically lower wage job market and not our high wage jobs. In fact, if you look at high wage job growth, you kind of pull that out, we're actually losing jobs in some of those in some of the largest markets in the country when you look at high wage job growth. That's a little bit of a risk indicator to me. Also, when the Fed raises rates before it tosses us into a recession, it's usually 9 months on average from the peak of the rate to when the recession hits. So I think everybody sees where we're at today, and there's this little like, oh, out of the woods mentality. Not so much so, in my opinion. I think there is more lag in the system than people are taking kind of those overarching numbers for. I will say, and I know Leslie hit on this too, consumer spending, the savings rate, thank you government and their regular revisions on data, shows that consumers today have way more in savings than they initially estimated. And they weren't off by a little, they were off by a lot, like $1 trillion or 50%. Like that's like, I'm like, woo, we missed like a big message there. So consumers do have more savings today, but their share of wallet as they have, everything's more expensive, that's going to have an impact. And one thing we haven't talked about today that I would be remiss to not mention when it comes to consumer spending is the end of college loan or student loan payment forbearance. And the reason that I wanted to bring this up is because, yes, for 3.5 years, students haven't had to pay loans. And this debt is the second largest pool of debt. It's tied actually by automobiles as the second largest source of debt in the US behind mortgages. So that seems big, right? But let's put some numbers to it. The average student loan payment that resumed is about $400 per month. But how many couples do you know that both have student loan debt? So now we're talking about an $800 a month hit in consumer spending ability. That's less money to spend on goods, on services, whether you're a small business or a large. So to Leslie's point, I think affordability is going to be key. It's going to be, how can I offer those services and those goods that are affordable, because the consumer feels stretched in nearly every direction. I already shared kind of my future thoughts on housing. If people have more questions specifically about that, I know I did it in my intro, I'm happy to share where I think volumes or rents or prices are going, but I'll pause there and you guys can ask follow-up questions as I just kind of rattled off some of what I think is risk on the horizon, is what I would be calling it for 2024.
Yeah. Thank you. I want to encourage people to ask questions, throw it in the chat, or use the raise hand feature. Talk about your business or your industry, and have our panelists chime in on that. I want to ask, you both can respond to this, just about AI for a second, because I'll be honest, I don't have a clue how any of that works. I can't believe that there's some machine that's taking notes of this call right now that are going to be actually better than the notes we would take ourselves. I don't know about ChatGPT or how any of that works. But I get a little scared at this idea, Leslie, that there are 7 companies that, because of their investment in AI, have literally changed and impacted the economy. And is this going to be another bubble? Is this going to be just something that is so hot right now, but we're in for a major surprise like real estate has done in the past? And that might be a year from now or 5 years from now. But when we concentrate on these major new trends, those are really scary to me. What do you see?
I think you are not alone. I think there's a lot of skeptics out there on this technology. We'll just kind of label it that. For us, we are almost comparing it to the railway system. So it's going to bring a new industrial revolution to this country and to how we do things. For us, we are very excited about the AI impact to the healthcare space. So if you kind of get rid of just the tech bubble mentality, where are we overpaying for this technology, really think of it as an investment that these firms did early on. Microsoft, for example, was kind of a stodgy old blue chip tech company that's been around a very long time. Well, because of the data they have on the cloud, the technology keeps our data safer. So I would almost think that of these 7, that's a very good investment because they've been doing this a long time. They've acquired their competitors. You all know how this works in the small business world. And so they have now said all of this data that we're uploading and the cloud is so relevant to our day-to-day lives. It holds our pictures, right? It holds our passwords. It holds, we don't have those big machines at companies anymore storing data. It's all here. And so the safety of protecting that data is why they've become so successful from a performance standpoint. And again, why we believe AI is here to stay and from a revolutionary standpoint. Now, NVIDIA is a stock that's up over, I believe, 130% year to date. And that's really because of this other scary aspect in our in the new world, in this unprecedented, is because of cryptocurrencies. So globally, you and I as consumer have decided we don't want US banks to know our transactions and our information, so let's just do it on the dark web. Well, what NVIDIA says is, okay, in order to get these transactions done anonymously and, 400 or 43 million a second transactions that they do, they then wrote the technology that everybody else is using, such as Visa. So, there's a couple really good standout companies that we will never go back, in our opinion, of how we use this technology. It is a little concerning, and I think the biggest positive for us as a firm is how that will help the healthcare space, specifically around data, right? We're just not going to have this paperwork anymore, specifically around developing drugs and how the consumer reacts to those. And again, I hope there's going to be much more of a US focus. AI is very US driven, and that gets us very excited. So how that dovetails into these other non-technology sectors is the less scary realm. I hope I answered your question.
Well,
There's
I
a
think
lot out there.
I think you're telling me is, Paul, get with it. And I was talking to Hamza earlier today about how long it took me to get rid of my BlackBerry and go to the iPhone. And so I will have to figure out this Chat GPT thing, right? Yeah. And I finally got the Apple Watch too. So I'm just a little slow, but it's here to stay is what you're saying. And it's going to impact us for a long time. Yeah. Devin, what are you guys seeing? And what's the impact even in the real estate industry?
Yeah, and I love Leslie's analogy there to the railroad system, because that's, I think, a really good, unique way to do it and describe it. I've been saying it's the industrial revolution of our time. We're never going back post-industrial revolution, right? We have machines that are doing things that people used to do. We have computers doing things that people used to do. We also are in this country not readily growing the population the way that we used to. There's record number of job openings available in this country. AI is going to be our solve for this. We are now going to, I will very much dispel the rhetoric that AI is here to take jobs. AI is here to make us faster, to automate certain tasks, to allow us to free up and do other things. And I think you're seeing that. You're going to see the ability to move faster. I mean, it now takes, what would editing a book take? Days, weeks. You can do it in a click of a button. They have software that does this now. So it's going to take a lot of the manualness out of many processes today. It's going to allow the US economy to move faster. We aren't growing population. It's going to be a solver for that. So I see a lot of positives out there. It doesn't mean, though, that there's not going to be winners and there's not going to be losers, Paul, because I do think we are going to see probably overinvestment by in a certain space with the market the way it is now. It's, the debt and credit markets, if we want to get really technical, are very closed off. So if somebody overinvests, there might be a blow up in a technology related area. I think that's very realistic to think through when you have a new technology space. But I think this as an industry makes us far better than it kind of is something to be overly concerned about, kind of maybe more of a bubble mentality.
Yeah. All right, guys, I want to open it up. So let's ask some questions. Use the chat feature. You guys aren't shy. I know you have some questions for Devin and Leslie. You talk about winners and losers, which there are in any trend or period that we're going through. We've got people on the call and obviously in the community that are from literally every industry. So Leslie, are there any industries that you think should be feeling overly optimistic and any that really should be putting the brakes on and be a little bit more worried about what's going on?
Sure. I kind of highlighted healthcare a little bit from a technology standpoint, but if there's probably one sector we're very bullish on from an opportunistic standpoint, it is healthcare. If you kind of think back to the last several years, and again, regulation has done a lot of this, is so many of our healthcare companies moved their headquarters overseas, and they've now repatriated back. Well, why is that, right? If we learned anything during COVID, you and I want lower cost, things that are developed, manufactured, engineered here. And that is pretty exciting because that shift has been monumental. I have the pleasure of sitting on the American Heart Association's investment committee. And we actually met yesterday and we have oversight on $800 million. So it's a pretty serious group. The data around what is happening in the healthcare industry, specifically around these diabetes and weight loss drugs, is unbelievable. I will challenge each of you to maybe just go to the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, and just read up on Novo Nordisk, who is a Danish company that is, developed, manufactured, and distributing the Wegovy and the Ozempic. Eli Lilly is launching this Mounjaro. And so the American Heart Association is very excited that you and I are going to become healthier, to the tune that the losers of these blockbuster drugs are going to be, we're going to do less knee implants. We're going to need less surgical supplies, if you will. For example, when Pfizer launched Lipitor several years ago, that was a $2 billion a year drug. It was like a blockbuster, right? These commercials that you see are just everywhere. And so everyone's kind of jumping on what we don't believe is a bandwagon, but a major health initiative in this country. Ozempic is scheduled to be $12 billion this year alone. So that is changing the way we live, the way consumers are reading up on this, and the supply is very, very low. And so we're rushing to find ways to get healthier. And so it was really unique and eye-opening yesterday that not only are we living longer, but we want to be healthier during this journey. And, we used to be able to get a knee done and be back on the golf course in a couple of hours. Now we may not even have to have our knees done. So there's going to be winners and losers and kind of this new trend. And again, we think it's another one here to stay, but it's very exciting to talk about healthcare. Again, we just have not had any eyes on this sector for literally 10 to 15 years. Everything was on tech, just like Paul indicated earlier. So that to me is a very bright space. And I hope some of you are directly and indirectly touching the healthcare industry and some of these changes. That's very exciting. I think just from, I kind of talked about a few of those areas or names that we probably wouldn't be loading up on today because of the offset of these diabetes and weight loss drugs. But again, I think all eyes are on the U.S. And so a lot of these U.S. manufacturers we feel will be, beneficial for, again, some less regulation coming up, some additional tax credits that are out there. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the employee retention tax credit. That was how small businesses kept their employees going in the last 4 or 5 years, and that might even be extended. So I would be very bullish on the U.S. entrepreneur. There were 4,000 businesses created in the fourth quarter of 2022 alone, and that was when the economy was down and when the market was down 20%. So we're pretty bullish on, again, where that U.S. manufacturer can benefit.
Yeah,
directly and indirectly.
Yeah, thank you. We got a couple in the chat. I'm gonna go to that. Priscilla says, can one of you speak to the current scarcity of entry-level employment and the aging population, and even regionally so?
I'm happy to jump in on this one. So we do have an aging population in this country. Something we haven't talked about from a consumer spending perspective, and we're seeing it specifically in real estate today, is the massive wealth transfer that's about to occur in this country as the boomer population ages out, retires, and then eventually passes away. So yes, we have an aging population, but we do have, if you look at our country demographically, and the way we break it up is by 10-year cohorts, because I will give anyone $5 if they can actually tell me the year the millennial is born and the year the millennial it transitions to the next group, or the boomer, or Gen X, or Gen Z, or nobody knows. So we talk about it kind of in 10-year cohorts. And when you look in 10-year cohorts, yes, the boomer generation is massive when you put all those multiple decades together, but we have future generations, specifically those born in the 80s and 90s, when you pull in immigration, that are going to be very sizable and going to have just as much of an impact as that boomer generation. So I'm thinking of it less on the aging perspective and people moving out and do we have enough people to replace? Because our forecasts show we're going to see positive population growth for the first time in a few years after COVID-related deaths. And more, what's going to happen with the wealth transfer conversation, and what does that mean for the consumer? Regionally, so that gets to be a very, very different conversation by region. There's obviously been this the great migration that has happened over the last few years. We've seen that massively decelerate in the last 6 months, much less movement. And that is all tied directly to real estate, right? I can't afford to move. It would be nice to move. I can't do it anymore, etc. So I would say, let's take that one offline. Otherwise we might be here all day talking about the various regions. Leslie, I don't know if you have anything to add to the perspective.
You know, I've got a few tidbits. You know, the data is now coming out. You're absolutely right that folks are retiring just a bit earlier than their prior group. And again, a lot of that was driven just exactly what Devin said. My house is my biggest asset. The market rebounded, so my 401k looks a little better. I'm just gonna take the deal. A lot of companies in the last couple of years, in order to quote get skinnier, going into an economic slowdown, gave people a beautiful little package, and I think a lot of folks took the deal. With that being said, I believe the average number of years of service of recent retirees was they stayed at the same company over 15 years. If you go out to the market today, anybody under the age of 30, they've already had 2.5 jobs, if not 3 to 4 jobs. The next generation is perfectly happy with having 2 jobs, part-time. They want a DoorDash. And again, I don't mean any disrespect on my kids, but I know what they like to do. They don't want to do this 8 to 12-hour shift. They want to do 2 4-hour shifts. So as a small business owner, I think you may want to consider the difference in demographics and dynamics and needs of your employees. You probably have tons of resources to do that. In our firm, the one thing that we've used to retain and attract millennials, and again, they don't like to be labeled that, but Devin said that, you know, that's kind of how we're doing it, is increased benefits. It's not pay, it's stuff. They like longer paternity leaves, they like sabbaticals. Sure, they love 401k matches, but they want the qualitative stuff. Whereas the recent retirees were really all about how many vacation days do I get, how many sick days do I get, and what is the size of the package. That's been just a dramatic shift. And again, I think employers are probably about 2 years behind on figuring out this, again, new work-life balance. And it's very expensive when you look at all of the earnings that are coming out. Even Microsoft said that. Amazon got hurt big time last year. It's not the wage inflation that's hurting some of these companies. It's the stuff that the next round of employees are demanding if you want me to come here 5 days a week.
But I think it actually bodes well for what we talk about in small giants companies, which is culture and engagement and all that stuff that people want that's beyond pay and beyond the basic benefits. And so we've been kind of talking about that for years. And not everybody's listening still, but slowly but surely, I think I love what's happening. I love that the younger generation is a little bit more fickle and says, you know, it's not just about a paycheck, it's something more. And that's going to drive all this behavior that I think supports what we talk about as members of Small Giants. So I think that's a great trend. Dan had a question, as a marketing consultant, he said, I've seen a real slowdown in marketing spend and a lengthening of the sales cycle, both for my own business and amongst my clients, particularly in the B2B space. It feels like a recession to me. What are you seeing in the B2B space and the corporate marketing spend?
I can take that one, Leslie, if you want, because we are in the B2B space, and I do have a consulting business inside of JBREC. And so that is, Dan, you are not alone in feeling that. We are feeling that too. And that ties directly into kind of this macro affordability conversation that I've hinted to so many times towards, is there's just not as many dollars to go places today. Not as many deals are getting done, not as many new organizations or new products are being created as there is this massive affordability crunch on the financing side. So there's just not as much spend out there that's happening. And we're seeing it in our consulting business too. We're seeing less of that B2B work. So I hinted at this earlier, but I think we should touch on this conversation, which is when the Fed raises rates, everybody thinks mortgages, right? That's where your mind instantly goes, oh, the mortgage rate's going to go up. But the cost of capital for a business, whether you are small or you are big, now also got more expensive. And most of the time, business loans are not long-term like a mortgage. They're not 30 years. Most of them are shorter term debt cycles, somewhere between 2 and 5 years. Some of you on this call today, maybe you do have a debt. You have debt in your own business, right? You've gone to the debt markets. You have to go back out and you have to refinance your debt now. When you go to refinance your debt, Dan, you're going to have sticker shock, because the price on that debt is now incrementally more expensive than it was just a few years ago. And so, because somebody might need that debt to keep the lights on, right? I need that loan to help me to keep the property that I have, that I've leased or that I own, etc. I'm going to cut back on other discretions like marketing spend that, by the way, to Leslie's point earlier, AI might help me with, because I don't have the ability to spend in other arenas. Let me just do one quick case study so you can see how bad this has gotten. So if we take housing as the example of this affordability crisis, mortgage rates, highest level since 2000. Housing cost to income today, for consumers spend 46% of their income on housing. That's not a lot of room to spend on something else. Usually it's about 32. Home prices still rising despite this. Wages would have to jump 47% in order to counteract that. Incomes have only risen 42% in the last 10 years. Home prices would have to fall 30%. That's not likely given today's inventory standpoints. Mortgage rates would have to jump back to 3.2%. I just told you that's not likely. So what is likely is the 5% wage growth that we've seen over the last 2 to 3 years is not going to be here in the future. It just can't be. And so businesses are going to have to adjust to that. And I pulled a stat specifically for you guys, which is, this is from the National Federation of Independent Businesses. 37% of small businesses, which, by the way, make up 50% of today's private sector, plan to raise compensation this year. That's down 10 basis points from 47% just a year ago. So you can feel this like tightening of the belt in your business, Dan, in the way we're going to have to increase wages in this country, which, I mean, there's some argument that we avoided a wage price spiral by doing this. But I do think you're feeling this overall tightening, and I can tell you we're feeling it in our business too.
Really helpful. Hey, Priscilla, I know you had your hand up. If you want to unmute there, we'd love to hear your question.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. And so as you were talking, it made me think more, Devin, about my question. What we're struggling with, the client that I'm working with is in the Midwest and is struggling with getting people in the door. And part of it is wages. Like, how much do we keep raising the wages? Because if we don't get these people in the door at the front end to do this manual labor, our company can't deliver our goods. Our company can't get things installed. We can't meet the customer's needs. And culture is what I'm about and what we're working with them on, and trying to keep them focused on culture. but we've got that dynamic, right? I mean, how much, when somebody's coming in unskilled at an entry level, how important do you think culture is to them? And how much can that compensate for, do we still have to keep doing both, raise wages and,
Yeah.
I would say yes, but I know Leslie touched more on this, so I'll defer to her for her answer here.
thank you.
I'll let Paul touch on this. I don't know from a statistical standpoint. I think it's just a fundamental shift that employers are working with. You know, again, it's almost unprecedented. I think the wage increase, we believe, peaked last September.
I agree.
And I know that because of the earnings that are being released by all of these major corporations. And so then there's just this massive trickle down effect from large to mid to small businesses. So now that I think it's peaked with the mega companies, where again, that wage inflation or that mandatory wage increase to keep up with this cycle, we believe peaked last year. So I think there's hope for your clients. I think it's going to be a very long to 6-9 months until they see that difference. That is my perspective. Paul, anything else that you see just from a trend standpoint?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not like you guys who were with these great data resources, but I think back to my career years ago and the kind of employees that we had in my company, which was a healthcare call center business. So we're employing single moms making $30,000 a year. And absolutely, the package of culture versus just straight salary meant everything to them. But part of that was the messaging and the communication of that package to employees. So, for example, we had to share with them and even in some ways quantify for them the value of those other things that we were doing that made life a little sweeter for them, that made that work experience positive, that involved their family. And we would do almost like a total rewards spreadsheet to say, okay, maybe you're making, $14 an hour is your base. But when we start adding in all these other things and put numbers to the investment that we made, that's actually adding $2 an hour. Now, if for you, the straight salary because of your personal situation means that all that stuff is nice, but you have to have that to support your kids and put food on the table, then we understand that and we respect that maybe this isn't going to be the place for you. And I remember a few people saying that to me directly and saying, look, there's nothing like this place, but I can't afford it. I gotta be able to put clothes on my kids. And so that couple of dollars an hour straight salary is all I can do. And so it's a different day today, but I personally believe that people want that full experience for the most part. I know it's hard to get them in the door, but it's also incumbent upon the company to stay committed and to educate and communicate the value of those other things that they're doing besides the paycheck to folks.
That's very helpful. Thank you, Paul, because right now my client is in the middle of break fix. They're trying to keep things going and they're leaving culture behind and they're forgetting to brand it. So that's really helpful. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that.
I'm sorry. I think we tend to think it's a choice of one or the other, and it's not. It's definitely they are done together and they can exist together. So Devin, sorry, go ahead.
No, you're good. I agree with you. That's why I said yes and to the question earlier, Priscilla. We are a small giants business ourselves, right? So I'm doing that. I'm on the front lines of hiring employees myself and trying to see what the market's doing. And I can tell you, Priscilla, it's always changing. So what I think is most important is finding what moves the needle for the employment base that you're working with, because what your employment base is looking for and what the person who works at my organization is looking for are wildly different. So it's very important for you to meet people where they are instead of asking them to meet you where you are. So doing this benefit analysis, we do it annually. We look back and we talk to our existing employees, we talk to prospective employees, and we say, what do you want and how can we get it to you? And really having that open conversation, that's the researcher, I think, in me, is like, let's just do research and we'll figure it out. But having those conversations is really important because you also don't want to put things out there just to have them if that's not what people actually want.
Great point. Great point. Hey, Jim put a stat in the chat here that I've got to talk about because it's fascinating. He said, to your point, Leslie, what you were talking about with Ozempic, said the orthopedic manufacturers losing due to fewer knee replacements is fascinating. I read recently the United Airlines is expected to save 80 million annually due to the average passenger losing 10 pounds taking Ozempic. Really? I mean, are there that many people taking Ozempic? And if there's not that many people, then they're losing a lot more than 10 pounds, right, to get that average. Any other unexpected winners or losers that are on your minds?
Well, obviously, American Heart Association main mission is to put the tobacco companies out of business. I mean, like that literally is part of their, and now these vaping, and I'll kind of throw that out there and then you can jump on the cannabis train if you'd like to, but they are thrilled just around the research and, you know, what are these companies going to do with $12 billion to their bottom line? And so that's what we don't know, and who those benefactors will be. Healthier communities benefits all folks. And so I think there's more to come. I wish I had additional data around that, but you're right. I think it's almost limitless that a healthier population and a healthier community, how that benefits all. We all probably could have a really fun conversation around that. And again, American Heart Association is thrilled of, again, where the money's going to go and what it's going to support, and then who's going to, such as the tobacco companies, going to be completely stymied of their growth as well, and funding, marketing, and likely additional regulations. So, you know, they had, most of these drug companies have had, I believe, over 40 years of diabetic research. This is not a hot topic where we're just letting people inject themselves with these drugs. There is significant global research on this. And I think there's a lot more to come from a positive standpoint, and what these pharmaceutical companies do. I would make sure you do your research on the right ones. We are doing that for our clients, of course, and again, how they benefit from these blockbusters.
Yeah.
A lot of revenue.
Yeah, it's going to be amazing to see what happens. Let's kind of close out here with just a few minutes left. I just want to ask each of you, Devin, we'll start with you, just for words of wisdom, words of advice, you know, as we kind of close out 2023, look to 2024 for these smaller businesses, these entrepreneurs that are thinking about this, or either benefiting or suffering today based on the industry that they're in. What kind of advice would you share with them?
Yeah, I think it's time to sharpen all of our pencils. AI is going to be a tool that's going to help us sharpen our pencils, but I think that there's significant risk hurdles in the future that we're going to have to surpass. We'd be silly to ignore them. So this is a time where I am making calculated risk adjusted investments. So I'm thinking about the company, I'm thinking about our future, and I'm investing to grow because, like Leslie said many times, we believe deeply in the US market, but I'm making very calculated risk adjusted returns, and I'm sharpening the pencil to do so.
Very good. Thank you. How about you, Leslie?
I guess just a few takeaways, and this isn't anything like Paul's books about, you know, how to be calculated around some of this stuff. But I think if you make a difference, we probably don't do a good enough job of touting that. And so whether that is in your community, for your employees, for that flexibility with families, or just with your product or your innovation, find whether that is technology or resources to tout that. I don't think, you know, the world is looking for good. You know, the consumer is looking for who does make a difference, and, you know, take advantage of those resources to help you tout all of things that you're doing. Turn the television off. Remember, all of these stations have 12 hours to fill, and they get amazing advertising. We talked about marketing earlier, but, you know, take some of that emotion out of your life, and whether that's you as an investor, you as a business owner, again, or just as a consumer, that's where the bubbles come from. I could cite a couple of them, but I think you all could go back to some of the Super Bowl ads in the last 10 years, and a lot of those companies aren't here. So I'll leave that to you as a little homework. But turn the TV off and see what else is out there. And then, I would double down and be very bullish on the American entrepreneur. I think the spirit is very alive. The environment is very ripe, and I wish you all the very best. So
Wow.
thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, I love the optimism. We're going to end on that. Devin and Leslie, thank you so much for the expertise, for the data that is so important to us. And hopefully each of you got something out of that today. I certainly did, learned a lot to look forward to, a lot of uncertainty for sure. Hard to turn off the TV though. But thank you guys very much. And I'll turn it over to Hemsa, close us out.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Devin and Leslie, for such an insightful conversation. We are going to follow up with notes, the recording, and some resources as well by tomorrow. So look for that. And then just a quick note, we are in the busiest season at the Small Giants community. So we are getting ready for our annual conference, which will take place May 7 to 9 in Detroit, Michigan. So there's going to be some information in the chat, as well as the Leadership Academy, which is our 9-month certification program. Recruiting is happening right now, and that will kick off in January. And lastly, Sounding Board, which is our mentorship program, and we have a few spots left for this season. So take a look, and that will also be in the follow-up resources. Be well, everybody. Take care. We'll see you soon.